So in yesterday's web dev tip, we got our stats app set up with a title. So if the result from the API call is good and we've got some data, we'll put a heading onto the page just saying we're viewing the stats for a URL. But what we want to do now is actually create a table, and the redirects property that's inside of the data that's returned, we want to generate rows from that and display the accessed and location for each of those redirects. And so this is going to take a lot of manual creation of elements on the page, and I'll show you a couple of different ways to do it in this tutorial, but this is really where a front-end framework like React, Angular, Svelte, etc. Would be really useful, but we've taken the choice to kind of make a really simple app, but hopefully you'll learn some bits and pieces about creating elements manually and the pros and cons of doing it in different ways. So what we're going to do first of all is create a function to create the table element. So up here, as we did yesterday when we created the heading element, we're going to say create table. We could call it something like create stats table, just so it's a bit more descriptive as to what we're doing. And what we want to do is pass in the redirects that we're going to be using. So that's basically just an array of objects that has an accessed and a location property. So we could actually type that in here just so that we've got some help within Visual Studio Code and we don't do anything that we're not supposed to do within our TypeScript. So the redirects property that's passed in is going to be an array, and that's an array of objects as mentioned. So it'll have accessed, which will be a string, and location, which is also a string. So this function, what we're going to do, as we did yesterday, we're going to create a new table element. So the way you would normally create a DOM element would be to use the create element function. So we'd say something like table element is equal to document.create element, and then you just pass in the string of the tag name, so it's going to be a table. And then what we're going to do on the table, we're going to actually insert some table rows that have been generated from the redirect properties. So we're actually going to create a separate function for that as well. So we'll say create stats table row, just breaking things down just so that it's a bit easier to reason about what each function is doing, and separating the code so it creates a bit more of a descriptive layout of what we're actually doing. So this is going to be a redirect, and rather than an array of them, it'll just be the one object which we're going to generate a row from. So here you go, we've got a function where we're going to create a table row and just return it, where we can then populate this table element above here. So let's create a tr element. So the tr element is obviously for a table row. So we'll say document.create element.tr. And then what we want to do is we want to create the two TD elements, so for the actual cells in the table row, and populate that with accessed and location. And so of course we could keep repeating this process by creating new elements. So you could say TD element for accessed, for example, is equal to document.create element TD. But the other way of doing it is to just insert HTML as a string directly into the contents of a particular element. So for example, we could speed up this process by saying tr element dot inner HTML is equal to a string, and then we can pop in any markup that we like, which will populate this table row. So for example, we could say the TD to start off with is for redirect.accessed, and then we close that tag up, open a new one, and then just say this second bit is redirect.location. So that will have the same effect as creating each of these TDs and setting the text content of them individually. It's just about how much control you want over the elements after you've created them. So for example, although this will do the same job, these TD elements, we can't really select them within our TypeScript or JavaScript code because they've just been inserted as a string. So we'd need to do some further queries to actually select those if we want to make any changes later on. But because we're just going to be creating a table row and then passing it back to the table, this will be fine for our example. And it's just a demonstration of the two different ways of creating new elements within your TypeScript or JavaScript code. So from this function, we're just going to return that tr element. So we'll have a row element being returned from here. And once we've got our table element defined in the create stats table function, we'll just literally loop through all of the redirects So we'll say for each redirect, we're going to essentially on the table element just append a new HTML element that's been created dynamically, and that will be the result of this create stats table row function. And as you can see, it's expecting one of these redirect values to be passed in, which we've got in the for each loop here. So we can just literally say the redirect is passed in there. And then all we need to do from this create stats table function is just return the table that we're creating. So we'll return that table element. And this function can then be used to generate a table or the HTML markup for a table for any redirects that are passed in. So if we take that and skip down to where we're actually making our network request, we only want to really generate the table if the resulting call to the API is good. So this will be this section of the if statement here. So if the status is okay, we're appending currently a heading element onto the page that just says that we're viewing the stats for that particular URL. But what we can then do as well is for the strapline element is just append another child, which is basically a result of this function that we've just created. And we need to pass in the redirects data. So that's inside of this result value that's come from the fetch call. So result, and there will be a property on there called data. And inside there is a property called redirects. And so if you're wondering where that's come from, if we have a look over in the web app at the moment, you can see some calls down here to the API, and you can see that's the status property, that's the data, and then inside there we've got the redirects that show when the short URL has been accessed. And you might be able to just about see on the page that there is some data being populated there automatically, or via that function that we've just created rather. It's obviously you can't see it very well because the text color is black. So what we'll do is just skip on over to the stars.scss file, and don't forget we're actually reusing the common style file that we imported a few lessons ago, but we can just put our own styles on top of that as well. So we could either go into the common style sheet and update things globally, but if there's something specific we want to put for a particular app in here, then we can just add it into this section here. So let's just set the text to white, and that text is not a property of SCSS, so we just want to change the color to white. That makes a bit more sense. So if we go over there now, hopefully you can see the table is being populated with the accessed property from the redirects that are inside of this data that's been passed back. And also you can see that the location, because I'm running this locally, is coming up as localhost. So that's a good first step. We've actually got the table being generated and some information in there. A couple of things we need to do in the next tutorial, and that is to style things and also to put some headings in there. And also we need to look at what happens if there are no redirects in the actual redirects property that's been, if the URL hasn't been used yet, we want to display some message to the user as well to let them know that it's not that there's no data there, it's just that there haven't actually been any uses of that short URL yet. But that's it for this tutorial. Make sure you stay tuned for more web dev tips.